Hello everyone, and welcome to today's TSG webinar on the enforcement of chemicals regulations, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Richard Bishop. I'm going to be your chair for today's event, and I'm one of the senior consultants here at TSG Consulting. Now, I've been working at TSG since September last year, and prior to that I was a principal inspector in the Health and Safety Executive, where I created and led the enforcement team in HSE's Chemicals Regulation Division, or CRD. Now that team had responsibility for the enforcement of legislation like REACH, CLP, Biocides and plant protection products legislation across Great Britain. So I guess you know whose fault all of this is now. I was also fortunate enough to have been a former chair of the European Chemical Agency's Enforcement Forum. And on that note, actually, I'm very pleased to link across to my colleagues Mike Potts and Katja Vom Hofe. I'm sure they'll introduce themselves when they speak, but both are also heavily connected to the ECHA Enforcement Forum. Mike is the former UK representative right up until the time that the UK left the EU, and Katja, who is the forum's current chair. And thank you both very much for joining me today and giving up your time. So today we're going to be covering how enforcement happens in Great Britain, and also covering how it happens in the European Union, including talking about the role of the ECHA Enforcement Forum. We'll consider how best to prepare for an inspection by the enforcing authorities, and we'll give you some tips on how to stay compliant. We're going to discuss future developments in Great Britain and the EU in terms of enforcement. And at the end, we'll be holding a question and answer session at the conclusion of the presentations. But you're going to be able to ask questions throughout the webinar as we go along using the question and answer box that you should be able to see on your screen. Now, depending on how timing goes, we'll answer as many questions as time allows at the Q&A session at the end. But if we don't get around to your questions, so don't worry, we'll try to answer it by email afterwards. Just a quick note that due to privacy rights, I need to say that we've chosen not to display the list of attendees to everyone on the call today. All attendees will be in the listen-only mode throughout the duration of the event. And just to remind you, that the presentation is being recorded, and we should be able to email you afterwards with a link to the recording. Just before we start our presentation, for those of you who aren't familiar with TSG Consulting, we've been providing companies around the world with regulatory guidance and scientific expertise for over 30 years now. We help clients worldwide address the many technical and regulatory issues in taking their products to market in multiple jurisdictions using our scientific expertise, regulatory knowledge and understanding of local nuances to help clients navigate the very complicated and ever-changing regulatory landscape across the globe. We serve a number of key markets and industry sectors, including agricultural, industrial, consumer, food and beverage, animal health and medical, and our teams comprise scientists and regulatory experts, many of whom have previously held positions at regulatory authorities and industries, a bit like Mike and I being good examples. And our aim is to combine that scientific and regulatory expertise, contacts and knowledge of how institutions, public authorities and industry operate to best serve our clients. What I'd like to do now is hand over to my colleague Mike Potts, who'll deliver our first session today on the enforcement of chemicals regulations in Great Britain. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Richard, and hello everybody. Before I start on part one, as Richard said, the enforcement of chemical supply chain legislation in Great Britain, just a couple of words about myself. Similarly to Richard, I joined TSG towards the end of last year in November, and prior to that, I spent 31 years in the chemicals regulation division of HSE, initially in Biocides, delivering Biocides authorizations, and then moving across to REACH when REACH entered into force, starting off with a proactive communication strategy, and then working on the help desk and providing a UK representation on the ECHA's HelpNet forum, and then joining Richard when he set up the enforcement team. And for a number of years, I did enforcement of REACH, and then more latterly of all the supply chain legislations that we're talking about today. For 10 years, as Richard said, I was the UK member of ECHA's Enforcement Forum. And my last job before I left HSE was doing enforcement policy and strategy. So with that, I shall move on to talk about who enforces REACH, CLP, biocides and plant protection products legislation in Great Britain. As I'm sure we all know, these pieces of law are EU legislation. They come from EU legislation and they were lifted and shifted into GB legislation as and when we left the EU. They are EU regulations, which meant they said the same thing across all the territories, the EU and Great Britain. However, enforcement remains the sole remit of the member state, or indeed of Great Britain as well now. So each member state, like the UK has and Great Britain has their own enforcement regulations, which will set out who the enforcing agencies are, what the offences are, and what the penalties are, etc. And very briefly, over the next few slides, I will explain what they are for these pieces of legislation. In terms of what each member state does and what we do in Great Britain, everybody has their own priorities and strategies for enforcement. And as I say, I'll explain what they are in the next few slides. Katja will talk about the priorities in the EU via the work of the forum. Companies are very well advised to be aware of who their enforcers are, understand how they operate, and if necessary, enter into communications with those. And Richard, in I think section 4, will talk about how to interact with enforcing authorities. So then, in terms of enforcement responsibility, not going to go into this in too much detail because we don't need in this webinar we don't need an in-depth detail of who does what, etc. But in general, to understand what duties you have as a company supplying chemicals or whatever, and also for the enforcement, it's important to look at the model of a very simple supply chain model. And this slide kind of explains the top of a supply chain, the distributors, etc., in the middle of the supply chain, and the people at the bottom of the supply chain using the chemicals, whether that's an industrial chemical or a biocidal product, pesticide product, etc. Once a company understands what duties they have, they can deliver those duties, but also it will detail who is the relevant enforcing authority for that particular duty. All the regimes are broadly the same and broadly split into the three areas that I've got there. The top of the supply chain, so those people that have registration duties, for example, under REACH, have product authorization related duties under biocides or under plant protection products, etc. And the enforcement duty on those people at tops of supply chains rests with the Health and Safety Executive, and particularly the Chemicals Regulation Division within the Health and Safety Executive, where Richard and I previously worked. In terms of supply chain related duties, all the regimes work on a model that's an existing model. This isn't new for chemical supply chain legislation. It's the model that works for all supply across Great Britain, in that HSE will be responsible for trade-to-trade sale or wholesale, and it will be the local authority trade and standards departments for retail sale. So there is a split there where it's HSE at the top of the supply chain and then local authorities at the bottom of the supply chain. Local authorities will also always deal with advertisement. So if products are sold on the internet, on fulfillment houses platforms such as eBay and Amazon, etc., or indeed their own websites, advertisement will be covered by the local authorities. In terms of use-related duties, there are a number of enforcement regimes to enforce health, safety and environmental legislation. If you look at REACH, there's about 9 enforcers that will enforce use-related duties. Those duties are given, those enforcement duties are given to the enforcers that have historically had those previously, before REACH, biocides, etc., came into force. So if you're a company that historically has been used to seeing a health and safety executive inspector for use-related duties under, for example, COSH or something like that, you will see a HSE inspector for the purposes of REACH-related use. If you are a company that used to deal with the environment agencies, then you'll continue to deal potentially with an environment agency inspector for the purposes of use of chemical supplies. And this corresponds with a piece of law called the Health and Safety Enforcing Authority Regulations. And what that does is that prescribes in great detail who has the authority to enforce in a particular shop or a particular sector, dependent on the main use of that particular area, particular shop, particular site. And within those regulations, there's an A to Z appendix which details all the sectors, and then it will highlight who has the responsibility for them. So that will often be a split between the health and safety executive, and local authorities. One example of that, and it's not related to chemicals, it's just one I always happen to know off the top of my head, that local authorities have responsible for use on golf courses, for example. So if you used a plant protection product on a golf course, it would be for the local authority to deal with that, unless it's a local authority owned golf course, in which case a health and safety executive would do it. So it does go into that level of detail in terms of defining whether it's HSE or local authorities that do that, and therefore it's easy for the enforcers to know what they've got the responsibility for. But of course, the companies, the duty holders, also will be able to see who their relevant enforcing authority happens to be. Okay, so just looking at the legislations quickly, independently, REACH is enforced using the REACH Enforcement Regulations 2008. That was a piece of law that was drafted by DEFRA because they hold policy lead for REACH back in 2008. And it provides a self-contained enforcement framework for REACH. So it's a self-contained piece of law that sets out enforcement responsibility and powers and offences and penalties. So that will be for the health and safety executive, for local authorities. They will all be able to go to the enforcement regulations, identify which duties they have a responsibility to enforce, what powers they have to enforce those, any non-compliance, and what penalties are appropriate to levy for non-compliance. As I touched on before, it is multi-agency enforced. There is the health and safety executive, the environment agencies, local authorities, and there's also a small remit for nuclear installations in the Office of Rail and Road, etc., etc. And as I said before, it gives enforcement duties to those enforcers that previously had responsibility. So what it doesn't do is it doesn't create a single enforcement authority for REACH. It gives as much as it can down to those people, those enforcers that previously used to deal with the particular issue prior to REACH coming into force. And CRD, Chemical Regulation Division of HSE, lead on REACH enforcement for HSE and also have a role to provide advice and support to other enforcing authorities. And with our previous hats on, Richard and I spent a lot of time helping out and training and providing advice both to HSE inspectors and to inspectors from local authorities and environment agencies, etc. So in terms of CLP and biocides then, the policy lead for CLP and biocides rests with HSE. So they created a piece of law which is titled there, which I shall call the BPC regs, which are domestic legislation that supports CLP and biocides, and also other pieces of law called PIC, prior informed consent. That's import-export legislation. That came into force in 2013 and consolidated a number of pieces of existing GB law, and it creates competent authorities for CLP and biocides and a designated national authority for PIC. But importantly, in this context, it establishes the enforcement regime for CLP, for PIC and biocides. And as I previously explained, the broad model is that in the supply chain, it'll be HSE for wholesale, local authorities for retail, etc., etc. And then finally, for plant protection products, there are two relevant pieces of legislation for the 3Ps legislation. That's the plant protection products regulations themselves and the sustainable use regulations. These are pieces of law which set out the duties, but also set out the enforcing regime, etc. And that's kind of the plumbing of that is slightly different in the sense that it gives the enforcement responsibilities and powers to the Secretary of State and to the ministers of the devolved administrations, and then agency agreements are created which give HSE effectively those functions of Secretary of State and ministers for the purposes of enforcement, which effectively means that responsibility for the enforcement of 3Ps defaults to HSE. Again, the enforcement responsibility is split between HSE and local authorities, although in this particular instance, HSE does have some degree of powers to be able to enforce retail sale. So with that then, that's kind of why, who does what, etc. So looking into part two now, we'll have a little bit of a look about how HSE will enforce issues and non-compliance in Great Britain. HSE's enforcement strategy broadly recognises two fundamental approaches. education, help and promotion to increase levels of compliance, and then a range of interventions, both proactive interventions and reactive interventions, backed up by formal enforcement where appropriate. And I'll pick up those as we go along. The key thing there is the first part, I think, the education, the help and promotion. I think HSE realizes and understands how difficult these and complex these pieces of chemicals legislation are, and how easy it is to go wrong accidentally. People not intending to go wrong, but they do. So HSE will work with their own help desks and with trade associations, etc., to try and get industry to understand what their duties are and make them compliant, and such that they get it right before they get it wrong. HSE isn't really about hiding around the corner, waiting for something to go bang, then running around and prosecuting somebody. They'd much rather things didn't go bang in the first place. And if a company and an industry is compliant so that they don't have to take more formal enforcement action, then that's seen as a good thing by HSE. But where HSE are the enforcing authority and things go wrong, it tends to follow this sort of simple model of enforcement. So if HSE identify any dangerous activities, in HSE speak, if there's a risk of serious personal injury, or in the case of sometimes biocides and pesticides, if there is a particular environmental risk involved, HSE inspectors can prohibit dangerous activities immediately. As you'll see later, they have a tool called an enforcement notice, which they can serve to prevent a dangerous activity or to stop a dangerous activity happening immediately. Once that danger has been removed, then HSE will work with the duty holder to ensure that there's sustained compliance moving forward. So if there is a product that is being used, a substance that's being used without appropriate containment or without appropriate PPE, that activity will be stopped. The company will be required to provide its personnel with PPE or to provide adequate conditions of safe use. And then once that's done, there will be sustained compliance in that area moving forward. If HSE think the duty holder has something to answer for, if there's been an accident, somebody's been injured, then it will hold duty holders to account. And by that, I'll probably mean to prosecute them if it's appropriate to do that. HSE's approach is pragmatic and case by case, and it'll look to distinguish between willful and accidental non-compliance. It appreciates that people could be accidentally non-compliant through no fault of their own, and particularly if the non-compliant company kind of confesses to HSE and they ring HSE up and say, we're really sorry guys, but we've gone a bit wrong here, can you help us please? The level of enforcement then will be much of a softer approach than it would be if HSE find a company that have willfully tried to hide their non-compliance from the authorities. Okay, so HSE have a number of decisions kind of to make when they consider what sort of enforcement action to take, and HSE calls these duty holder factors really. It will look at what the duty holder's enforcement history is. So this is not just necessarily across chemical supply chain legislation, but it will be across the whole remit of HSE's responsibility, so the Health and Safety at Work Act, occupational safety and health legislation, etc. And if HSE is looking at a company for the very, very first time and they've just made a slight mistake, that will be treated slightly differently to a company that have got historical and sustained fundamental non-compliance within their business. It'll take into consideration whether the duty holder was deliberately seeking economic advantage. Have they not registered a biocidal product and therefore undercutting their competitors who have placed a legitimately compliant biocidal products on the market, for example? Has there been an incident? Is there actual harm to man or the environment from the non-compliance? If there is, that will be taken quite severely. What are the general standards of condition of the premise that the company is operating in? Has the inspector got confidence that the company can and will comply? If they have, then they might just be fairly soft in their approach and issue some verbal advice or a letter with some recommendations. If the inspector is not confident that the company will comply, then they might be more rigorous and more robust in their enforcement actions, and they might issue a legal document called a notice, which I'll talk about in a few slides' time. HSE will also consider some strategic factors. Is the action in the public interest to take action? Is the action proportionate? There's no point taking significant resource and significant action against a really quite minor breach. What will be the effect on other duty holders? For example, if HSE would prosecute a company, they will often then issue a press release after following that prosecution to say this company were doing such and such a thing wrong, they were prosecuted, they had to pay a fine, etc., etc. And the hope there is that that will be a kind of a cascade effect, that many other duty holders in that area will say, oh no, HSE have prosecuted somebody for doing what I'm doing, I'd better stop doing that very quickly. So one enforcement action then can have a cascade effect on to a number of other duty holders, such making them compliant without actually having to enforce or inspect against those. HSE has a couple of tools called the Enforcement Policy Statement and the Enforcement Management Model, which assures that all of HSE's activities and enforcement are proportionate, targeted, accountable, consistent and transparent. And if anybody wants to read HSE's EPS or EMM, they're online on HSE's website. Okay, so in terms of the enforcement outcomes then, HSE can issue verbal warnings, letters with actions, recommendations, etc. The lighter end of this. The notices that are mentioned, if there's an activity on that's posing a risk of serious personal injury, as I said, there will be a prohibition notice served which will stop that activity immediately. If there's a breach of the law, but it's not particularly causing a risk of serious personal injury, they can serve an improvement notice, which requires an improvement in standards, and often there will be a period of time allowed for that improvement to take place. An enforcement notice is a notice which allows a HSE inspector to prohibit an activity that doesn't cause a risk. So, for example, putting a non-hazardous biocidal product on the market fundamentally isn't risky, but it is against the requirements of the legislation, so that product can be taken off the market via means of an enforcement notice, and that's particularly relevant to REACH registrations as well, for example. And at the higher end, it can caution. HSE can issue a formal caution or prosecute companies if it's in the public interest to do so, and there is an evidential basis for that prosecution. And HSE will always follow the Crown Code for prosecutors in that context. Other possibilities of enforcement action include takedowns. That's particularly relevant for internet sales. If there's a listing on we always tend to pick on eBay and Amazon here, don't we, because they're quite big ones, but there are many other internet sales sites where listings can go on, and HSE can work with those listing sites to take illegal listings down. They can issue safety alerts. They can initiate investigation higher up the supply chain. Often if local authorities, for example, say, oh, we found a retail sale product that's not great, that's illegal, that's non-compliant, HSE then can build up the supply chain, take action at the top of the supply chain. Often we call it, chopping the head off the snake. So if they take action right at the top of the supply chain, then that can filter down multiple supply chains, and we can create compliance going down numerous supply chains with just one well-targeted investigation, etc. HSE can also initiate proactive work if they find an area that's got particular non-compliance through complaints, then they can undertake a proactive project to look at that sort of sector or area. And also HSE can pass cases on to other regulatory authorities if it's in other regulatory authorities' remit to do that. Go through this slide quite quickly. It's the penalties. All the pieces of legislation at both lower magistrate court level and higher court, Crown Court level, magistrates and judges can issue an unlimited fine, and that's quite a severe penalty, and it has to be dissuasive because it can be expensive to have a REACH registration or a biocidal product authorization. So the unlimited fine then allows for a large fine if the company have not submitted a registration or an authorization properly. And although HSE tend to deal with companies, if there is a sole trader or a controlling mind or a director of a company, as Richard will explain later, it is possible in all the pieces of legislation except for 3Ps to actually send somebody to prison. And HSE has done that, and Richard has a case study to demonstrate that later. It is important to note that under CLP, biocides and plant protection products, there is a due diligence defence, and in REACH there isn't. And what that means is it can be a defence for a person charged to prove that the person took all reasonable precautions and exercised all due diligence to avoid the commission of that offence. And if you can prove that under CLP and Biocide and 3Ps, you will be not guilty of that offence. Unfortunately, under REACH, even if you can prove that, you will still be guilty of that offence, and then you'll have to rely on the proportionality of the HSE inspector to take the action that's appropriate in that particular case. So in terms of mechanism of cooperation and of information exchange, in Great Britain and the United Kingdom, we have a group called the Enforcement Liaison Group. This was set up by CRD to bring all together. It was all REACH enforcers and interested parties such as DEFRA as policy lead, and that was set up to mirror the ECHA Forum. That was currently under review. One of the last jobs I had in HSE was to review that that group. And so that review is taking place with a view to expand the remit of the ELG to cover all the areas that in the European Union the forum does. And with that mention of the forum, I shall finish there and pass you across to Katja, who will talk about the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today to speak about EU enforcement and about the role of the forum. My name is Katja Vom Hofe, and I'm currently the chair of the forum at the European Chemicals Agency. And apart from this task, I normally work as a lawyer for the German member state competent authority, which is the Federal Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. It's a horribly long title, and we're much better known by our abbreviation, which is BAUer. And that's what I do when I'm not dealing with forum tasks or attending conferences like this one. I'm happy to be here. And this is what I brought for you today. It's coming up in just a minute, I think. There we go. I'd like to give you a quick introduction to the forum for those of you that are not as familiar with our group yet. And then we'll take a quick glance at the EU enforcement, the challenges and the chances that there are. And in that context, we also look at the role of the forum in EU enforcement. And then at the forum projects, which are probably our most renowned output of the activities that we do across the course of a year. And I'm trying to change the slides around, but it's very slow in responding. So if you bear with me for a second, it should be coming right up. There we go. So the forum is a network of all EU and EEA enforcement authorities. It was established by the REACH regulation back in 2007 and is located in Helsinki at the European Chemicals Agency. So that's where we're based. That's not where we are for the past few years because due to the COVID pandemic, of course, we had most of our meetings remotely. But in theory, we are located at ECHA in Helsinki. We're the central body to develop and implement harmonized enforcement in the EU member states and also in the EEA states, which are connected to the forum. And we try to do that by conducting harmonized enforcement projects where we check thousands of inspections per year, where we address what we hope are the most up-to-date and challenging subjects that there are in enforcement in the chemicals legislation. So who are we? Our group comprises of representatives of the 27 EU member states. That's the forum members, as we call them officially. And then we have a number of guests. We have 3 representatives from the EEA states as guests. We have support from ECHA, from the European Chemicals Agency. So we have the scientific and technical staff coming in and supporting us. We have Commission colleagues joining our meetings, and most of the time we're joined by colleagues from DG Grow and DG Environment for the REACH and CLP parts, but we also have colleagues coming in from DG Sante for biocides or DG Taxud when we're dealing with cross-border issues and need to have support from customs colleagues. We also have invited experts coming into the forum at a regular basis from national enforcement authorities. So these are the inspectors in the field, and they provide us with a much needed practical background to all the questions and issues that we're dealing with. And then we're also liaising with stakeholders, and we do that at least once a year during our open sessions, but we also have joint workshops where we discuss project findings. If you haven't received an invitation to one of the open sessions of the forum yet, and if you are one of the stakeholder organizations, it's probably because at the moment we can only invite accredited stakeholders, which are accredited with ECHA. So you need to be registered with the agency. How to do that, that's shown on the website. So if you haven't done so but would be interested to learn more about us and even join us in one of our sessions, then please see at the ECHA website how you can register yourself and then potentially also join the forum for one of our open sessions. Looking at the EU enforcement for a minute, there's a very central clause which says that the enforcement is in the sole competency of the member states. And Article 125 of REACH says that member states shall maintain a system of official controls and other activities as appropriate to the circumstances. Now, if there was ever a blanket clause, that's probably it, because this clause can be filled by pretty much everything that you can think of. A system of official controls and other activities as appropriate, well, that doesn't give too much guidance, and that provides one of the challenges in EU enforcement of chemicals regulation at the moment, that you have different enforcement systems and structures that were set up by the member states. They are not harmonized. Competencies differ from member state to member state, and so do the systems in which enforcers operate. And also the sanctions, so the follow-up actions, are not harmonized. So the follow-up to enforcement actions will be different depending on in which member state you're based. Of course, whenever a member state has its own system, there are also some benefits, some chances to it. Enforcement can be tailored to the situation at national level, and I'll give you just one quick example why this is very helpful. You might have a member state that deals with a lot of imports, so they can tailor their enforcement and make sure they're looking at imports predominantly, whereas another member state might have, like Germany, my member state, for example, has a lot of manufacturers of chemical substances. So for us, it's logical to not only address imports, but to also address the manufacturers in our member state. And that, of course, is only possible because we don't have just one joint system, but every member state has its own system and can organize their structures and their competencies accordingly. The key areas of enforcement usually also match the national priorities, and that's a good thing. But then the question is, how do you harmonize enforcement across the EU then? And how do you ensure a level playing field? And that applies, of course, to the duty holders that are based in one of the member states, but also especially for the ones that are based in more than one member state. And I would like to go to the next slide, which is the role of the forum, because the answer of the European Commission to that question, how do you harmonize everything, is the role of the forum. The tasks of the forum are listed in a very long article, 77.4 of the REACH regulation, and I've shown it here on screen to you. But REACH is from 2007, so some of these tasks are even slightly outdated already. But in short, if we can go to the next slide, I can tell you that our task is to harmonize enforcement in the 30 EU and EEA states across Europe. And we have a mandate to harmonize enforcement for the REACH and CLP regulations, and those were our original mandates of the forum. And then PIC and POPs have been added on, and so has the BPR regulation. And we're dealing with BPR through a dedicated subgroup on biocides, which is called the BPRS. So if you've ever heard that, that's our subgroup of the forum that we set up to deal with the biocides activities. And we try to harmonize enforcement through our main activities and outputs. We have projects, and I'm going to talk about these in detail in the next couple of slides. But we also do a lot of activities that are aimed at supporting inspectors at the member state level. So we develop best practice guidelines for inspectors. We develop IT tools so they have access to the databases of ECHA, of the European Chemicals Agency. We give advice on the enforceability of restrictions. When new restrictions are coming up, they usually pass by the forum, and we give an input on the draft texts of those restrictions to say whether we think they are enforceable. And key questions for that are, for example, are there analytical methods that are suitable to determine whether a product actually has that substance in it in a concentration that's mentioned in the restriction, for example. We do trainings, sometimes for stakeholders in our joint workshops, sometimes for inspectors in workshops that are closed off then to stakeholders and industry representatives and NGOs, because there we want to talk about details that maybe are not for the public eye. But then we have regular workshop with stakeholders where we discuss the results of our forum projects and also the recommendations stemming from these projects. And with this, I think we're coming to the next part, which is the forum projects. And there are two types of projects that we have. We have reach and force projects, they're called REFs, REF projects. Don't let that acronym fool you. These are also covering CLP and PIC and POP topics. We thought about changing the name of the acronym when new competencies arrived with the forum and when we got a mandate that was expanded to other legislations. But REF was already a well-known acronym at that time, and it's sort of stuck, and we never really thought about changing it until we sort of sudden had a REF project on CLP. Now we think we're kind of confusing everybody, but it's too late to change now. The acronym is much better for a second type of major project, which are the BEF projects. Again, major projects where all the member states in the EU and EEA participate, and those are the Biocides and projects. We have one REF operational every year, and we try to have BEFs, so Biocides projects, operational every other year. The group dealing with biocides is a little bit smaller than the forum group. The resources are a bit less than for forum work on REACH and CLP, PICs and POPs. And so we only have one project every other year. But those are the major projects that you might have heard of before. We also, in addition to that, have pilot projects. Those are smaller projects where only a number of member states participate. We usually have about somewhere between 7 and 15 member states participating in pilots. They address more concise subjects, so things that we would like to try out for ourselves, where we would like to develop best practice. Sometimes we use them to set up REF projects at a later stage. So for online sales, for example, we were looking into doing a project at the pilot level, and then later on we develop this into a full-blown REF project. Pilots are usually operational for about 6 months within a time frame of a year, whereas the major projects, REFs and BEFs, are operational for a full year. The most renowned REF project is our REF 8 project on online sales. It's one of our most prestigious projects so far on what we can only call a very hot and interesting topic at the moment. If you follow the European Commission's chemical strategy for sustainability at all, that's one of the target areas where improvement is sought all over Europe, because online sales is just one of the key topics that we need to address in the following years. And REF 8 was about enforcing REACH, CLP, and BPR duties related to those substances, mixtures, and articles that were sold online. The project was operational in 2020, and then last year we collected the results, and we just recently published our report on this project. And the background of the project was very simple. As you all know, there's a massive increase of online sales and has been over the past few years. It was especially fueled by the COVID pandemic, where online sales went through the roof because people were sitting at home, not going out, not going to the shops, so they ordered everything online, of course. And when we did some checks on these projects that were sold online, NEAs, so National Enforcement Authorities, found that the information on hazards was regularly lacking on the sites where those projects were sold. And we felt that EU cooperation was needed at that level because obviously products are sold across the whole EU. The same offer is often made in multiple member states. So of course it would make sense to also address the enforcement in different member states. And so that's why we decided to start a forum project on this topic. And the scope of the project was very simple. We addressed the usual REACH Annex 17 restrictions, the usual candidates. We checked safety data sheets, so that's Article 31 of REACH. We looked at the availability and the correct language of the safety data sheet. So we didn't even look at the content, we just made sure there is a safety data sheet, and it is even in the language of the member state where the product was actually sold. We looked at articles in CLP on advertising and labeling. That's Articles 48 and 17. And again, the same advertising of biocidal products that were sold online. That's Article 89 of the Biocidal Products Regulation. And we approached web shops and marketplaces, but no private sellers. We thought private sellers, that's a very small group, and we wanted in our project to address the main sellers on the internet. Webshop meaning all websites that directly sell goods online. So if they didn't directly sell goods online, they're not considered web shops. They're rather some sort of facilitators that were not targeted. We also addressed the main marketplaces, and those are probably the ones that you know of when you think of marketplaces. I think we all know who the big actors are there. If we look at the results that were provided by the 29 countries that reported back to us in the course of the project, we checked over 5,700 projects in the course of this subject. And mind you, it was during the COVID pandemic, but we were very fortunate because at the time when nobody could go out, we did a project on online sales, which is probably the most ideal desktop inspection that you can possibly do from at home. So we were not too hampered by the pandemic in terms of this particular project, hence the high number of products that was checked in there. And our findings were unfortunately what we expected from previous pilot projects that we had done in the past, that the overall non-compliance rates were extremely high. So if we looked at REACH restrictions, 78% had a violation of at least one of the requirements that you need to fulfill if you want to sell a product with the restricted substance in it online. We had a 5% non-compliance rate only with the safety data sheet, so people were actually pretty good with this one. But mind you, again, we didn't check the content, we just simply checked the availability and the language in which it was available, and that was available online. But we had high non-compliance rates, again, in terms of the advertisement duties under CLP Article 48. 77% of BPR of products that we checked had a deficiency in terms of BPR duties that were there for that specific biocidal product. These figures have a tiny grain of salt to it because many member states took a risk-based approach when selecting the products that they checked. So they didn't just randomly go online and check every offer that they found on the internet as a random target, but they actually looked at areas where they suspected that there might be a non-compliance, which is normally what you do when you enforce. You don't go around randomly and looking at everything. You try to target your resources to those areas where you think you might find non-compliance that you would like to make right again. And hence the results are not a study of the entire market, but they are what they are. They are the findings from at least over 5,700 product checks, and so they need to be taken seriously nonetheless. Another item that we found, which was sort of surprising, was that the non-compliance rates for the marketplaces were significantly higher than for web shops. So whereas for web shops, we had, if you're looking at all the duties, we had an overall non-compliance of 65%. For web shops, it was 95%. And that's, again, of all duties, if multiple duties were checked for the same project. So staggering results that just undermine the need for more actions that need to be coming up in terms of online sales. And I think a number of actors, including the European Commissions, are working on it, are addressing it. And I think it just goes to show that this is the area where we need to focus our efforts in the upcoming years. Another project where the operational phase is over was REACH Enforce 9 on authorizations. Another interesting and also challenging topic where we checked for compliance with REACH authorization requirements. So we checked whether substances that are subject to an authorization requirement and that were placed on the market had been granted an authorization by the Commission through a Commission decision. And we also checked whether the uses of these substances complied with the conditions that were set out in these authorization decisions. So inspectors actually went on site and looked at the conditions on site to make sure that they match with what was given as a condition for use of that substance in the authorization decision. And in order to do that, authorizations are a complex matter, and they often go into and reach into and span out into areas that are beyond REACH. And so inspectors cooperated a lot with customs, with OSH inspectors for occupational safety and health, and also environmental protection agencies for environmental issues. It was very interesting because we set up a lot of good cooperation at that level. And this is why this project made sense also on that level to establish the cooperation. The state of play with this project, which involved all the 30 EU and EEA countries, if we can go to the next slide, was that the operational phase is over now, and now the reporting phase is ongoing in 2022. We have a bit of a delay due to COVID, unfortunately, here. So I'm afraid to say that I don't have any results to share yet. I wish I could bring you the first interesting figures, but the data are still being reported back from the national inspectors, so from the member states. So we don't even have all the data yet, so we can't make any, not even the most rough conclusions yet. We still expect the report to be ready in the last quarter of this year, and then once we have it, we'll introduce it in our open session and also publish it on the ECHA website. So please make sure to look out for this one. The next project I'd like to quickly introduce to you is the one that's going on right now on integrated enforcement. Integrated enforcement means assessment of chemical compliance of products, and that can be substances or mixtures or articles, with different types of legislation. So obviously we focus on REACH, but also on the POP regulation, and those two go hand in hand when you look at some of the restricted substances under each of the regulations. And the idea is that inspectors pick up one project and look at it from different angles, from different legislation that needs cooperation with other authorities too. Sometimes if there are different competencies for enforcing different legislations, you need to cooperate very closely. And that's one of the aims of the project, to establish that cooperation between authorities. The project will address consumer products and products for professionals, including the ones that are imported into the EU. And the national enforcement authorities are free to select the categories of products that they're going to check. And we kind of hope that it will therefore fit into their normal enforcement schedules, and so allow as many of NEAs as possible to participate in this project. If we look at the timelines of REF 10, REACH Enforce 10, the operational phase will be ongoing until the end of this year, and then we'll be reporting on it in 2023. And again, we expect the final report towards the end of next year and publish it as well. And then we'll have a workshop on the findings and recommendations from this project planned during the end of 2023, maybe beginning of 2024. Looking even further ahead, and the last of the REACH Enforce projects I'm going to introduce to you very briefly is REACH Enforce 11, which is going to be operational in 2023, so coming up next year, is a project on safety data sheets. Well, we've had a number of projects on safety data sheets already in the forum, but we have a new Annex 2 to the REACH regulation. That was a Commission regulation, and you can see the number right here, that had a new Annex 2. And the new Annex 2 has new duties, so it's a good time to check these again and to check that safety data sheets are in conformity with the requirements of this annex. The questionnaire and the manual for inspectors are still under development, so I can't give you any more details than that, but it sure will be an interesting project coming up, and yeah, it'll be operational next year. Coming to the last project, I'll quickly introduce it to you. That's a biocidal project that's going on at this moment. The operational phase of BEF2 is ongoing until the end of this year, and again, reporting next year, final report ready at the end of next year. And it's on the control of biocidal products, including product authorizations and use of approved active substances. And maybe most notably about this project is that it will include checks of disinfectants that are widely used in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everybody was trying to buy disinfectants yeah, over the course of last year. I think a lot of these products are still in use. And so it's time that inspectors look into this and make sure that they comply with all the requirements that are there in place. Another focus area of this project is national transitional measures that are also checked if the active substances in the projects have not been approved yet. And so in total, this should then make up of the Biocides enforcement project. So that was a quick overview. And with this, I thank you very much and hand it back to Richard and Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katja, for the overview of the activity going on at the ECHA Forum, and there's an awful lot of it, isn't there? I'm starting to, it makes me feel a bit old actually, because I can remember being there at the inception of the very first REACH Enforce project, which I think the name was proposed by the member from the Netherlands, if I remember correctly, actually. But yeah, now on to number 11, I think. So. Right, so thank you very much, Katja. I'll take over from there because we're going to move on to the next part of the presentation. And what we're going to do now is really cover give you some advice and tips as to how to prepare for an inspection or investigation if you're subject to one from the national enforcement authorities. I suppose the first thing that you'll probably be asking if you do get selected is why me, perhaps. It's probably the sort of question you can't actually ask the enforcing authorities, because it's their right to visit you, and you can't really question or challenge that. But hopefully this will give you a little bit of an insight as to why you might have been picked. And generally speaking, the enforcing authorities will conduct their activity either reactively or proactively. Now, there are different sort of terms for this across the European Union, but generally speaking, the reactive process is often called an investigation, and a proactive process is often called an inspection. And the investigation, the reactive process, will be normally prompted by an event. So the enforcing authorities will be responding to something that has happened, and that could be something like an accident or an incident that has triggered an investigation. But actually, in our experience, more often than not, it's triggered by one of two things. It'll be because another business or somebody else, perhaps an employee or something like that, has raised an issue about you. So that could be that a competitor company, for instance, has believes that you're non-compliant in some respects, and wants the enforcing authority to look at you. The other area that you'll often see issues come in reactively is where one enforcing authority informs another enforcing authority about non-compliance, and that can happen within the same country. So, for instance, earlier you heard Mike say that in the UK, you've got trading standards authorities and the health and safety executive, and one might find a product in one location and inform the other authority of it. And this happens across countries as well. So in the European Union, you may find that a product is available for sale in France that has originated in Germany, and one authority tells the other, so that matters can be progressed further up the supply chain. Now, typically investigations will focus just on the subject matter of the thing that is being investigated, and certainly in the UK at least, that's historically been the majority of HSE's enforcement work. Now, proactive work is different. This involves the authority actually deciding for themselves what it is that they want to inspect on. And the Reach Enforce projects, for instance, that you've heard Katja talk about, are good examples of these. These are proactive projects that enforcing authorities have chosen to do, and they're normally on a selected topic, such as a specific chemical substance, an industry sector, a particular legal duty or type of legal duties. And these are often quite wide-ranging in nature as well. And certainly it is the ambition of the Health and Safety Executive in Great Britain to conduct more of this type of work. Now, that's probably why they'll want to visit you, but actually they don't always visit. I've used the word visit, and perhaps it's misleading in some respects, because quite a lot of this can be done remotely. They don't, the enforcing authorities don't always have to come to your site. They actually can conduct inspections and investigations with never having stepped foot in your premises, and that's because a number of duties in chemicals regulations kind of lend themselves to a remote approach. So, for instance, if you're checking whether a product available on the market has a product authorization, or if you're checking whether a safety data sheet is compliant with the requirements of REACH, you can do that remotely. You don't need to visit a site to do that sort of thing, and that has advantages for the enforcing authorities, because they've got limited resources, as you'd expect, and it means that instead of sending people traveling around the country, actually they can just have someone doing it at a desk, and you can get through more cases that way. In fact, actually, you can make these checks without a duty holder, without a company even being aware that they have been scrutinized remotely, especially if information is made available on the internet that the enforcing authorities check. The other advantage for the authorities is that quite a lot of this can be done covertly as well, and we've heard problems already now in terms of online marketplaces. Now, you can obviously surveil those. There are rules around enforcing authorities doing covert surveillance, but this can actually be quite an advantage. It's even possible to take enforcement action remotely as well. And now, having said that, a lot of the visits that Mike and I used to conduct when we worked for HSE were in person, and that's because it makes sense sometimes, actually. It's often easier to explain quite complex legal requirements, especially to businesses who aren't you know, particularly aware of what the rules are when you are face to face with someone, rather than say by email or letter or something, where, you know, key messages can get lost. There are some duties that you actually do need to turn up to on site to actually have a look at site conditions. So for instance, I've got the example of REACH and strictly controlled conditions for intermediate registrations. And of course, you need to be at the site to see whether conditions are strictly controlled. Enforcing authorities will probably need to go to a site if they need to gather evidence. They can also consider or take the opportunity to consider looking at other legislation as well while they're there, and they can also bring other people with them as well. So there are a number of reasons that they might turn up to you in person, but equally there are some good reasons that they might actually never turn up to you and just speak to you remotely. If they do decide to turn up, they will normally tell you, and these are for practical reasons more than anything else. If they tell you, then it gives you the opportunity to make sure that you can gather all the necessary information and get all the right people together in the same room, or at least on the other end of a Teams call or something like that these days. And that's because with chemicals regulation compliance, very often the people that have to comply with this aren't necessarily the people at the site. You might have regulatory managers who are located in a different site or even in a different country in some cases. And so the enforcing authorities will often want to say they're coming to give the site the chance to prepare. They won't always, though, and enforcing authorities will have considerable powers of things like entry, powers to gather evidence, powers to take statements and things like that. And that's because some duties you do need to turn up unannounced, out of the blue, to check certain conditions. And that will typically be around things like complaints about poor working practices, or perhaps restriction conditions, you know, so or conditions of compliance with authorization conditions and things like that, because you really don't necessarily want to give a company too much advance notice in those circumstances, because you really want to see how things take place in reality. And of course, if you do have a visit, or even if you're subject to inspection remotely, there are things that you can do. Now, I tend to think of this as you know, keeping the enforcing authority as happy as possible, because the more you do of that, the more positive a response you're likely to get from them, or at least you should get some credit given to you for engaging with them in a constructive and helpful way. I tend to think of it as making it as easy as possible for the teacher to mark your homework. So get some information about the subject matter of the visit in advance if you can. So, you know, will there be an agenda? Will they need to visit parts of your site? You know, which parts of your site will they need to visit? There might be some bits of your site that you'd rather they didn't visit, but you know, you need to ask them these sorts of questions. What work processes need to be observed? What documents need to be assembled? What staff do you need to have present? You might even want to consider offering at least the inspector an overview of your business and activities. Now, obviously, remember, you'll know exactly what you do and how you do it. There's absolutely no guarantee that the enforcing authority will know that. So it can help actually to just give them a little talk through what you do and how you do it at the site. You can assist the enforcing authority in advance in certain practical respects as well. You can make documentation available to them in advance. You could even give them directions to site if it's hard to find, or PPE requirements, or you know, how you actually get through security, etc. And obviously get the right people in the room. Consider not just how you can demonstrate compliance for the particular topic that is under consideration, but also you might want to think about how you can show the systems that are in place that underpin it as well. So demonstrating that you've got the right people in place, the right procedures and processes, the right amount of resource given to it, and the right level of competence and training. Now, one thing that often comes up is that you may already know that you're weak in certain areas, vulnerable. You may even be non-compliant in certain areas. So you've got some options there. I mean, you could, of course, just see if non-compliance is actually discovered by the enforcing authority. I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend that you be open and upfront about it. But whatever you do, don't lie about it or deliberately conceal non-compliance, because that really is an aggravating factor that will count against you. That really does annoy the enforcing authorities. we're all grown up in this, you know, the enforcing authorities are grown up, you're grown up. They know that sometimes, despite your best efforts, you may still end up in non-compliance, particularly with, you know, supply chain legislation, because, you know, sometimes actually the non-compliance is a result of actually someone above you in the supply chain having failed to do something, and it takes the whole supply chain out. So things like the amount of effort you've gone to try and avoid it, the seriousness of the breach, and the other factors you've heard Mike talk about earlier today are relevant here, and you can raise them in your defence. When the intervention's over, when the visit's over, ask for feedback. Now, hopefully you should be given feedback without having to ask for it, but you know, ideally get a summary of the visit, the key findings, the proposed action on the day or shortly afterwards. And it's a two-way process, so use these interactions to ask any questions that you have as well. It's really important to be very clear on what you're being required to do and by when. And there is a difference between being required to do something versus being given a recommendation or a suggestion to do something. A recommendation or a suggestion are often made by enforcing authorities, and you're probably best listening to them because they know what they're talking about. But you know, you don't have to do those, but you do have to comply with the law. So it's important to be clear on what you're legally required to do. Of course, if you disagree with that, and you know, let's remember, enforcing authorities employ human beings, not robots, and they get things wrong sometimes, or they might have misunderstood something that you've said, or the way in which you do something. So you know, you're well within your rights to challenge it, but obviously do it in the right way, you know, in a sort of helpful, constructive manner rather than a confrontational way. Now, if you're subject to enforcement action, then very often there will be some sort of right of appeal to that, although not always, actually. Not you know, certainly in the UK, not all enforcement notices can be appealed. But bear in mind that a lot of enforcing authorities will keep registers of enforcement action that they take, and they make these registers publicly available. And of course, that can have some quite serious implications depending on the sector that you work in, because other people in your supply chain will be able to see that you've been subject to enforcement action. So take legal advice if necessary, take advice from consultancies if necessary. And if you're not going to make a deadline, be open with the inspector. Deadlines are flexible and can be extended if there are good reasons, but just make sure you tell the enforcing authority before the deadline has passed that you'll need extra time, not afterwards. Raise any confidentiality issues proactively. Public authorities are normally subject to freedom of information legislation. And I'll finish with an example of how not to do it, actually possibly the best example of how not to do it that I can think of over my time in HSE. And it involved a company based in Northampton that were selling chemicals online through their website and through marketplaces such as eBay and Amazon. And they were selling illegal products. Initially, it was brought to our attention that they were selling a sodium chlorate based weed killer, which you're not allowed to use sodium chlorate as a PPP active substance anymore. And then the further investigation, when we looked into it further, it turned out that they were also selling paint stripper containing dichloromethane, which is restricted under REACH. Now, in this case, notices were served by HSE, and those notices instructed the company to stop selling those products. The company in question deliberately and willfully continued to breach the spirit of the notices, certainly, by simply withdrawing that product, renaming it very, very similarly, and then putting a new listing back on the online marketplaces. So new notices were served, and then they cheated those notices by essentially doing the same thing. And this happened a number of occasions where HSE were really just left with the option of then prosecuting them for because of all these, you know, the aggravating factors involved. The company director thought he would be able to escape prosecution by dissolving the company, and thereby meaning that there is no company left to prosecute. And what the director then failed to realise is that HSE would then have no option but to bring charges against him as an individual director, as in his own right. And all of a sudden, that made imprisonment an option to the court. And so the magistrate's court actually declined to sentence. They didn't feel that they had enough powers of sentencing and committed the case of the Crown Court for sentencing, who imposed a 10-month prison sentence on the individual, and away he went there and then off to prison. It wasn't suspended, it was a custodial sentence imposed immediately at Warwick Crown Court, and those are the pictures that you can see on the slide. So a pretty extreme example really, but that's exactly how you wouldn't do it. And to be perfectly honest, 99% of the time people are perfectly reasonable and you don't get into these circumstances. So with that, I'll pass back to Mike now for the last sessions, and we'll talk about future developments in enforcement. So back over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And thank you, Katja, before that for those sessions. So I'm going to do the last two parts now of the webinar. This first part 5, looking at future developments in enforcement across the EU and Great Britain. So in terms of the enforcement priorities moving forward in kind of the UK and the Great Britain, one of the big things that's coming to pass on the plant protection product pesticide side is a piece of legislation called the Official Control Regulation, OCR. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next couple of slides. But in terms of what HSE are going to look forward to do, both Richard and myself have talked about reactive and proactive work, and we both said that the majority of HSE's activity at the moment is based on reactive work, complaints coming in effectively to the enforcement team, and they deal with those. Now that's all well and good, but enforcing authorities really want to decide what they want to do for themselves and not be directed, if you like, by the complaints that come in. So HSE is moving towards more proactive work, and OCR is that, and as Katja said, the REF projects are those as well. And HSE will try to look for inspection campaigns based on intelligence-led, risk-based work, often influenced by the findings of reactive work. And as both Richard and I have said, if HSE finds a number of complaints on a particular sector, a particular biocidal product type, for example, or a REACH authorization that's not being followed particularly well, and there are lots of reactive work coming into them, then what they will do is that they will target that sector or that duty or a group of companies and do an inspection, a proactive inspection campaign. One of those things that they've done has been on internet sales. You've heard Katja talk about Ref 8, wasn't it, on internet sales, and HSE, and particularly CRD, have been looking very hard at internet sales for some time now, both proactively and reactively. Historically, HSE inspectors would go to a premise, kick a door down and do the enforcement activity. It's harder to do that now on the internet. And certainly in my time within CRD, we were trying to get some quite sophisticated covert intelligence gathering of illegal products being supplied on the internet. They're also looking at the expansion of the Enforcement Liaison Group, as I've mentioned, to cover not just REACH, but also other pieces of chemical supply chain legislation that we're discussing today, and possibly even wider than that. Katja mentioned the chemical strategy that the Commission have published. DEFRA is also looking to publish the GB chemical strategy in 2022, possibly 2023, and again, that might influence the direction that enforcement takes in Great Britain. So I just want to touch on OCR, the Official Controls Regs then. This is a piece of law that falls out of the plant protection products regulations. And in terms of its enforcement via agency agreements, this kind of internal plumbing that I like saying of legislation, HSE, CRD and local authorities are the enforcement authorities. Now the OCR regulation is a new piece of law, and it kind of places new duties on anybody in the plant protection product supply chain to do something. So those people that manufacture plant protection products, process them, import them, distribute them, sell them, etc., those that use plant protection products, there is a new duty now to notify HSE of the duties that they do. Are you a manufacturer? You will have to tell them that, etc., etc. Now, the duty at the top of the supply chain, as you'll see there, was already passed. You should have done that if you make plant protection products or sell them. You should have done with that by the 22nd of September 2021. If you use plant protection products, then you have got until the 22nd of June this year to notify onto that list being held by CRD. If you start doing that for the first time, then you have 3 months from the commencement of your processes to put yourselves on one of those 2 lists. The notification is a relatively simple process. As you can see there, you just have to say who you are, what you do, and where you do it. And once you've done that, you're on the list, and that is those duties then covered. HSE has taken a significant exercise to recruit what they call pesticide enforcement officers, or PEOs, into CRD. A lot of acronyms there, I do apologise, to check on those lists. So what they will do is they will check those people that have done those notifications and that they are on their list and they are compliant with their obligations under pesticides legislation. But equally, and perhaps more importantly, also undertake intelligence gathering exercise to find those people that should be on the list but aren't, and identify why they decided to not put themselves on the list. Did they just forget? Were they not aware, or were they willfully trying to duck their duties under the legislation? And HSE will also provide support and advice to the other enforcing authority. Local authorities, remember, they will be doing retail sale in this area. So this work is likely to represent probably the biggest and most substantial proactive inspection campaign that CRD and HSE have done in the chemical supply chain area. So a take-home message: if you are in the plant protection product supply chain, if you've done what you need to do, or you're preparing to do what you need to do, then you can sit back and relax a little bit. If you think, oh my goodness, I should be doing that, I should have done that already, then I suggest that you take a little bit of a look into OCR. And if you are in the top of the supply chain for pesticides and you haven't done that notification, you should have really done so already, and you should seek to address that quite quickly. In terms of enforcement priorities in the EU, I'm not going to touch on this too much because we're not in the EU anymore. However, obviously TSG are covering both GB and the EU, so we can assist with all of this, of course. And as I said before, member states set their own priorities, etc. But what's important, and I'm not going to read all those bullet points out there, but there were certain parts of the Commission's chemical strategy that did impact on enforcement, particularly the minimum requirements, and also allowing public and NGOs to become kind of eyes and ears on the ground, etc., etc. So the Commission are very clearly identifying enforcement of this sort of supply chain legislation as a really, really important thing for member states to do. And then finally, just a little session now on tips of how to remain compliant. Richard's kind of explained what happens when an inspector calls, if you like. So this section will give you some tips on perhaps what to do if they do call, or maybe what to do to avoid them calling at all. Very important, as we said before, just understand your position in the supply chain, because it determines your duties. What do you get from where? In REACH terms, are you a manufacturer? Are you an importer? Do you have registration duties? If you do, can you reduce those duties by changing your position in the supply chain? Can you buy your chemical from, in terms of a GB-based company, for example? If you're importing your chemicals from France or from Germany, you become an importer now in REACH terms and would have a registration duty. Can you avoid that duty by purchasing your chemicals from a supplier based in Great Britain, for example? Look at your company. What do you make? Are you making chemicals that require, for example, CLP classification, labeling and packaging, safety data sheets? Are you making articles? What sort of duties under REACH do you have for those articles? Do you have to consider restrictions, REACH restrictions if you're making articles? Are you making a biocidal product? What are you selling? Are you providing to your customers everything that they need in terms of product labels, safety data sheets, etc., etc.? Once you've identified what you do and what you need to do and how you're seeking to address that, some questions that you may ask yourselves internally. Have you got sufficient resources? Do the people that are dealing with chemical supply chain compliance, do they have enough time? Do they have enough people within your company to deliver what you need to do? Are those staff competent? Do you need to outsource that to a competent body? Do you need to employ a consultant, for example? Do you need to ask your trade association for help? How are you going to deal with areas where you're perhaps a bit vulnerable, not quite got the competence to deliver or the time to deliver what you need to deliver? It's important that everybody in the company knows what they're doing. If everybody else thinks somebody else is going to deliver the safety data sheet or the product label or whatever it is, and nobody does it because somebody else is doing it, that's going to be a problem for you. So define your responsibilities clearly, manage change properly, have arrangements in place for keeping up to date. The REACH lists, the restriction lists, the authorization lists, they change. Chemicals get classified under CLP. Things are always moving on in chemical supply chain legislation. Dates for biocidal and pesticidal products to be approved and authorized and renewed, etc. They're always coming up through. They might be different now in the EU and the UK. Really important to keep up to date with what you need to do and when. Always have a system for monitoring and auditing your compliance in your company, and have appropriate arrangements for managing change. I've mentioned that already. There's plenty of guidance out there. HSE and ECHA's websites are full of guidance, all the way from sort of bite-sized leaflets that HSE call them, 3 or 4 side entry-level pieces of guidance, all the way up to the ECHA hundreds and hundreds of pages about how to submit a REACH registration or how to author a safety data sheet. It's there at every level for you to help you. Industry can help within itself with trade association publications, etc. In terms of sources of help, HSE has help desks across all the chemical supply chain legislation. So does the European Chemicals Agency. Both HSE and ECHA have e-bulletins. I'm sure many of you on this webinar will have signed up to both of those. If you haven't, I would strongly recommend you do so. They're issued bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it is, and they give a sort of 1-2-sided summary of key developments in that particular area, in that particular time frame. And if one of those things of interest to you, it gives you links to go away and look in a little bit more detail to get the information that you need. You can get help from your supply chain. Your customers might help you, your suppliers might help you. Already mentioned trade associations, consultancies can help. TSG can help you with compliance assessments, identify where your weak areas might be. We can help during enforcement activities, etc., etc. Always plan ahead. As I said before, keep on top of what might change, so you're not thinking, oh my goodness, that's going to change on Friday lunchtime and I'm not ready for it yet. Understand what your deadlines are. Some of these things take time. Biocidal products, pesticidal products, they take time to get the authorizations through. Don't be going to the authorities with a few weeks to go when they can't then process your application because you've left it too late. Make sure your company has enough time. Have you got access to get information, to author labels, etc., etc. Just make sure you plan ahead and you give yourself enough time. Also be aware of divergence. I've touched on it just already for a second. There will be different dates now for product authorizations in Great Britain and in the EU. Annex 14, Annex 17, the REACH lists, they will start to diverge potentially. If you're supplying across EU and GB markets, just pay attention to what chemicals are controlled in what areas, because that might affect your supply chain. You might not be able to buy chemicals from the EU anymore because they might be banned in the EU and they're not yet banned in the UK, for example. Above all, and perhaps just to end now, document everything that you've done. The due diligence, whilst REACH doesn't have a due diligence defence, as I said, an inspector will be looking to make sure that if you are non-compliant, what have you done to try and be compliant? Have you asked your supplier things? If you have and you've got an answer from them, if you've documented that, even if that puts you in non-compliance, at least you can demonstrate, well, I've asked and I've been told this and I'm acting in good faith. And a HSE inspector would often take that into account when taking enforcement action. Make sure you have systems in place and the people to deliver compliance. And finally, who is your phone a friend? When it all goes wrong, who are you going to pick up the phone to? Is it going to be a trade association? Is it going to be your supplier? Is it going to be the authorities? Is it going to be a consultant? Any of those things are an option, but it's always best to have kind of an exit strategy from non-compliance, etc. Somebody at the end of the phone who can help you. And with that, I'll pass back to Richard, who will monitor the questions that have come in, and we'll have the question and answer session. So thank you everybody for listening.
And thank you very much, Mike, as well. That concludes the presentations, and so we'll now move on to take some questions from attendees. The first one is about biocides, biocidal products, and I mean, this is probably a Great Britain-based question, so I'll probably address this to Mike if I can. The question is, can you comment on HSE's approach to companies who are selling non-authorized biocidal products? And also, as well as that, does HSE monitor products on the market or companies on the Article 95 list? Mike, if I could pass that one to you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, I'll deal with that one. It's likely that HSE, if they find an unauthorized biocidal product, will issue one of these legal notices that Richard and I touched on. That requires either an improvement notice or an enforcement notice, and that will require the company in hand to correct their non-compliance. So non-compliance will be placing a biocidal product on the market without an authorization. That's the breach of the law, and the notice will require that breach of law to be rectified. And notices usually give direction as how to correct that non-compliance. In this case, go and get a product authorization would be the obvious way to correct that non-compliance. And often people will be given an amount of time to do that. The product will only be taken off the market if the authority think there's a risk of serious personal injury, kind of as I said. So there might be a period of time to allow that product authorization to go through the process. Companies can also usually comply by what HSE would call any other means. And any other means in that case would be take the product off the market voluntarily. That would also comply them with that notice, because they would have removed the non-compliance from the market. In terms of monitoring products on the market, HSE really doesn't, I don't think, has a resource to monitor all those products. The vast majority of issues that would be dealt with by HSE in this context would come from complaints. You know, a company that's doing the right thing would see a product that's on the market illegally and then would go to HSE and say, we've got our product properly approved, this lot haven't, go and sort it out for them, please. So it would be, we would fall into that reactive category that Richard and I have spoken about. And the same would apply to companies on the Article 95 list. It would more routinely be a reactive dealing with non-compliance rather than a proactive. But as I've said, if HSE came across lots and lots of products that were illegal in the same product type, in the same sector, it might then decide to do an intelligence-led proactive campaign to just run a little campaign in that particular sector if there is a large amount of non-compliance compliance found reactively. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Mike. The next one, it presents a little bit of challenge, actually. So I think I'll give Mike a breather and ask Katja to deal with it first. But I think it's both an EU and a GB question. So I think we'll need answers off you both. But I'll start with you, Katja. The question is, well, actually, the question asks whether the HSE is suitably resourced in terms of people and funding to robustly apply and enforce the pertinent frameworks, but the questioner has asked the same question to Katja from an EU perspective. So I'll throw that one at you first of all, Katja, if I can, and allow Mike a little time to think as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and also to Richard, the other Richard, for asking the questions. A very clear answer, yes and no, as always. Don't you like when people do that, yes and no? If you ask any national enforcement authority across the EU, they will tell you that they need more resources, both financially for testing, for example, and at a personal level in terms of inspectors, because there are more and more duties to check for inspectors, and the controls are becoming more and more complex over time. The national enforcement authorities, to my knowledge, almost all of them, made up for this by constantly improving their efforts. So what they're trying to do is they use synergies as much as they can. They cooperate with other authorities as much as they can. They try to do better targeting, try to pick up only those products and articles and substances that where they think they might find a non-compliance. and they are developing more efficient techniques. And the forum is helping out with this as well. So we're trying to support inspectors and trying to support national enforcement authorities through all the activities that help inspectors, guidances, manuals, questionnaires, workshops, trainings, etc. So trying to share the burden. But in the end, enforcement resources are limited, they are scarce. And if NEAs are asked to do more and to increase their efforts further in these areas, and voices have been on this from Commission side, from NGO side, but also from industry side, who's saying, well, you need to do more. We want to be inspected actually because we all feel we are compliant, whereas some, say for example, products coming into the EU or maybe not. Then there will need to be also an increase in resources, because I think that NEAs across Europe are stretched to the limit with their resources. And if anything extra is asked, I think it has to come with extra resources from member state level, maybe also from Commission level. That's my position on this one. On HSC, if they are sufficiently resourced, I don't know, but maybe Mike knows. So I'll give this part back over to you.
Okay, thank you. I can kind of say the same thing that you just said there, Katja. I mean, the more inspectors HSC or any national enforcing authority has, the more that they can do. That's kind of an obvious thing to say, isn't it? And as I said in the last couple of slides, HSC are recruiting the pesticide enforcement officers to deal with a particular issue, the implementation of the official control reg. But generally speaking, certainly, I was going to sound a bit perverse now, when Richard and I left HSC, we're recruiting more inspectors after losing a couple of them. But yes, they are recruiting more people. They could always do more. You know, you can look proactively rather, at as many sectors as you like. If you have another X number of inspectors, they'll be able to do another X number of inspections. So, you know, kind of the more the merrier to some extent. But also, as you said, Katja, and we've covered in a little bit in the presentations, you have to be smart. You have to take action at the top of the supply chain. You can go for desk-based activity because you can check a safety data sheet from your desk rather than going on site to check one. So there's a number of things that you can try and do smarter, work better, cascade your enforcement and work that better as well, and target appropriately as well. You know, I used to say in HSC, well, I'm only going to get out of bed and visit a site if I'm pretty sure they're non-compliant, because why would I go to a site and spend a day inspecting them when we don't find any non-compliance? So it's important to do, from an inspector point of view, your pre-flight checks, if you like. You know, be pretty sure that when you turn up to a company, you've done all the initial assessment and you're pretty sure you're going to find non-compliance there, so that you're making kind of the most out of the visit. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you, Mike, for that. I must say, actually, and it's a slightly offhand comment, I probably could have employed a whole team of people just to police online marketplaces alone, actually, but it just depends on how much effort is proportionate to the results, I suspect, from a matter of government and public policy. I think we've got time for just one more question. And I'll do it as well, because Mike and Katja have been doing a lot of the heavy lifting today. The question is about intermediates. In the EU, if your EU supplier only has an intermediate registration and you as a downstream user cannot handle the intermediate under strictly controlled conditions, what are the options to reach registration compliance? And actually, it's a really good question. It comes up from time to time. For these purposes, it kind of depends whether the downstream user is in the EU as well or in Great Britain, because if they're in Great Britain now and they're importing the intermediate, then they'll need to register it themselves, or available, you know, or some other transitional measure like the downstream user import notification process might be available to them. So I think for the purposes of a sensible answer, I'll assume that the EU supplies the EU holder of the intermediate supplies that intermediate to another EU downstream user who doesn't use it under strictly controlled conditions. Now, it's a strange situation, because the person who's not using to strictly controlled conditions, the downstream user, isn't the one that's actually breaking the law there. Article 5 of REACH says no data, no market. And so if you're not handling and using under strictly controlled conditions, actually it's the registrant who's in breach. And so in this case, it would be the supplier of the intermediate. Having said that, it doesn't mean that downstream users can just use substances with impunity and not have to worry about strictly controlled conditions. They will be asked by their supplier to sign a letter confirming to the supplier that they have put strictly controlled conditions in place. We refer to these as Article 18 letters because that's the provision of REACH that is involved here. And of course, if you're subsequently found not to be handling under strictly controlled conditions, having confirmed to your supplier that you have, that could well have contractual, financial and legal implications. And I suspect your supplier isn't going to want to supply you anymore. So it will put your continuity of supply at risk as well. So I hope that answers that question. I'll just quickly, I mean, unless Katja and Mike quickly want to come in on that, I'm just looking at the time. So I think we do have some questions left, but I think what we'll do is apologise if we didn't get to your question, and we will try and follow up by email after we close today's call in the next few days. So I think I'll probably wrap up now. We'll be sending you a link to watch the presentation in the next couple of days, and we also plan to make a copy of the slides available to you as well. And please do get in touch via emailing info@tsgconsulting.com if you've got any more questions specific to your business that we can help you out with. Can I thank Katja and Mike once more for their time? It's been a pleasure to have you with us. And can I thank all of you as well for joining us today as well, and for giving us your time. I'll draw the event to a close now and wish you all the best. Goodbye.